We had gone camping deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest road that the only sounds we expected at night were wind through the trees or maybe the occasional animal moving through brush. There were 4 of us, and we had set up 2 tents close together on a patch of flat ground just off the trail. We spent the evening the way most camping nights go, collecting wood, cooking over the fire, telling small stories to pass the time. By the time we zipped into the tents, the air had gotten colder, the fire was just glowing embers, and the forest had gone into that still, heavy quiet that makes you realize just how far you are from other people. I was sharing a tent with one friend. The others were in theirs a few feet away. We laid in our sleeping bags, talking a little before letting silence take over. I remember being on the edge of sleep when I heard something faint outside. At first, I thought it was the trees shifting, but then it came again, low and steady. Heavy breathing. It was close enough that I could tell it wasn't my imagination. The sound was deep and rough, like something with size to it. It wasn't quick like a raccoon's snuffle or light like a deer. It was slow, weighted, steady, almost like the sound of lungs straining with each exhale. The breathing seemed to come from just beyond the thin wall of nylon, and then it shifted, moving around the tent. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears, heart beating in my chest so hard that I thought the others must hear it too. The breathing moved slowly, one side of the tent to the other, circling. Sometimes it sounded a little closer, sometimes a little farther, but it never left. The pressure of it, the certainty that something alive was right outside, grew heavier with each minute. My first thought was that it had to be a bear. The woods we were in were known for them. I pictured a big animal drawn by the smell of our dinner scraps, maybe curious about the tents. The thought scared me, but it made sense. Bears breathe heavy, they pace, they sniff. I held on to that idea as tightly as I could, trying to calm myself. But the breathing didn't sound like sniffing. There were no snorts or huffs. It was just slow, steady inhaling and exhaling, as though whatever it was simply stood there, circling, never leaving. It went on for what felt like hours. Every time I thought it might finally stop, it started again, moving to the opposite side of the tent, dragging its sound across the night. None of us said a word. The silence inside our tent was just as loud as the breathing outside. I didn't sleep at all. I kept staring at the faint outline of the tent wall in the dark, clutching my sleeping bag tight around me, waiting for the sound to fade. It never did, not until the first hint of pale gray light started seeping through the trees. Only then did the breathing seem to drift away, softer and softer, until it was gone. When the sun was finally up enough to see clearly, we all unzipped our tents. No one had to say anything. We could see on each other's faces that we'd all heard the same thing. The air was cold and damp, the fire pit just black ash. We stepped carefully around the tents, half expecting to see paw prints pressed into the dirt. Bears leave clear marks, big and heavy. But what we saw froze me in place. There were prints, but they weren't animal. They were human, boot prints. They circled both tents over and over, weaving close and then pulling back, but never leading off into the woods the way you'd expect. Just loops, tight and deliberate, right outside where we had been lying all night. I crouched down to look at them closer. The ground was soft from dew, and the tread was clear. A person had walked around our tents, breathing heavy enough for us to hear, for hours. The 4 of us just stood there, staring at the tracks. We had thought we were safe because we were miles from anywhere. We had assumed it was just an animal doing what animals do. But someone had been out there. They hadn't spoken, hadn't touched the tents, hadn't tried to get in. Just circled, breathing, making sure we knew they were there. That realization cut deeper than the fear of a bear ever could. A bear is dangerous, but it acts on instinct, food, territory, survival. A person out there, in the middle of the woods, moving around in the dark without a word, breathing heavy like that. It meant intention. Someone had chosen to be out there, to circle us, to make us hear them, and then leave without a trace except the prints. We broke camp in silence. The normal chatter of morning, coffee, packing, joking about the night was gone. Every sound of a branch snapping in the distance made us turn our heads. The trail back felt longer than it had coming in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone walking behind us. When we finally reached the car, the relief was sharp, like stepping out of a nightmare. But it didn't erase what happened. I keep thinking about those prints, about how close they were, about the hours they spent just circling us. Whoever it was never showed themselves, never spoke, never attacked. But they didn't need to. The message was clear. They had been there, watching, and we never saw them until morning. That night has stayed with me more than anything else I've experienced outdoors. I've run into animals before. I've had storms blow down trees near my tent. But nothing unsettles me like remembering that slow, heavy breathing moving around us in the dark, only to learn in the morning that it wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, and that makes me realize something I wish I hadn't. Out in the woods, it isn't always the wildlife you need to be afraid of. It's the people who decide to be out there with you, without reason, without warning, and without leaving anything behind except boot prints that circle your tent all night long. I had gone out camping alone in the woods late in the fall. The weather was cold at night, but the days were clear and quiet. I had pitched my small tent in a clearing near a line of thick pine trees, far enough off the trail that I wouldn't expect anyone else to wander through. I liked camping in places where I didn't hear cars or voices, just the sound of the wind through the branches and the crackle of my little fire. That night, after a simple meal and sitting by the fire until the flames died down, I crawled into my tent and zipped the door shut. The air was sharp and still. My sleeping bag was pulled up close under my chin, and I laid there listening to the silence settle in around me. For a while, everything was calm. The usual sounds of the forest filled the night. Occasional creaks of the trees, small rustlings in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. I had just begun drifting into that half-sleep when something pulled me out of it so suddenly that my chest tightened. It was faint at first, a sound I wasn't sure I was really hearing. Then it became clearer. A slow, deliberate scraping ran across the thin nylon of my tent. Not the soft brush of a branch, not the flutter of leaves, but the sharp edge of something hard. It moved steadily from one corner of the tent across to the other, like claws dragging along the fabric. The sound was high-pitched in spots, catching against the material, and then smoothing out again. I froze. My breathing slowed to the point where I felt like my chest wasn't even moving. Every sense of mine was locked on that noise. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whatever was outside would hear it. The scraping would stop for a moment and then start again, shifting its position. Sometimes it was near my head, sometimes near my feet. I kept staring into the darkness of the tent, knowing that only a thin sheet of nylon separated me from whatever was there. I told myself it might be a raccoon or a porcupine, but the sound didn't fit. Small animals scratch or rustle quickly. This was slow, heavy, and deliberate, like it was being done on purpose. The dragging stretched on, and then it would pause only to begin again on a different section of the tent wall. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't reach for my flashlight. I just stayed still, listening to every second stretch out until I thought I might suffocate from holding my breath. At one point, the scraping sound drew up to where my head was lying. I could feel the faint vibration of the fabric against my ear. Whatever it was right there, inches from me. I clenched my hands into fists inside the sleeping bag and just waited. After what felt like forever, the sound shifted again, sliding down the side of the tent toward the ground. Then, just as slowly as it had started, it faded away. The silence afterward was worse. I lay there in complete stillness, straining to hear any footsteps, any breaking of branches, any movement in the brush. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the woods and the ringing of my own heartbeat in my ears. I don't know how long I stayed awake like that, but I never truly went back to sleep. Every few minutes I thought I heard something again, but it would always turn out to be the faint groan of the trees or a squirrel rustling. When the faint light of morning finally came through the tent walls, I was still lying on my back, stiff and exhausted. I unzipped the tent slowly, half expecting to find something waiting just outside. But all I saw was the same clearing I had pitched camp in. The grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled of pine and cold dirt. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter of my tent, scanning the ground for any kind of tracks. The soil was soft enough that I should have seen impressions if something had walked around in the night. But there was nothing. No prints, no scuffs, not even disturbed pine needles. I crouched down, ran my fingers over the earth, trying to convince myself I had just missed it. But it was clean, untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. I looked at the tent itself. The nylon had no tears, no punctures, no marks of claws or teeth. From the outside, it looked perfectly fine, as though the sounds I had heard were just part of a dream. I stood there for a long while, staring at the fabric, remembering how close those sounds had been to my head, how steady and deliberate they were. I knew what I had heard. It wasn't imagination. The strange part that stuck with me was the rhythm of it. The dragging wasn't frantic like an animal trying to get in. It was too controlled. It had moved along the tent as if it was measuring, testing, or just trying to see if I would react. That thought left me more unsettled than anything else. If it had been a bear or some scavenger, there would have been evidence. But there was none. I packed up quickly after that. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag and collapsed the tent. Every sound in the woods made me jerk my head up. By the time I got back to the trail and started walking, I felt a small sense of relief with each step that put distance between me and that clearing. The memory of that night hasn't faded with time. It's burned into me. I can still hear the slow drag of those claws across the nylon, the pause, and then the shift to another spot. It was too real to dismiss, but too strange to explain. I don't know if someone was out there with a tool, messing with me, or if some animal had managed to move in a way that left no trace. Either way, the fact remains that I woke to the sound of something circling me, testing the thin wall that separated me from it. And in the morning, the ground gave me nothing. No proof, no answers. That's what unsettles me most, the absence of anything concrete. It left me with a story I can't explain and a memory that makes the hairs on my neck stand up whenever I crawl into a tent now. Every time I camp, I find myself staring at the walls of the nylon before I sleep, waiting to hear that slow, scraping sound return. It never has, but the silence doesn't comfort me. It only makes me remember the night it did. I had gone out on a short solo camping trip late in the season, one of those times when the woods feel half asleep, when the trees are bare and the nights come quick. I set up my small tent in a clearing that looked out over a valley. It was quiet, no sounds of other campers, no trail traffic, just me, the cold air, and the stillness of the trees. By the time I had finished setting up, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, ate slowly while the fire burned low, and then packed away what I could. My boots were muddy from the hike in, so before crawling into the tent, I slipped them off and left them outside near the entrance flap. It wasn't unusual for me. I didn't want to drag dirt into the sleeping bag, and I had done it plenty of times before without thinking twice. Inside the tent, the air was sharp and cold, but the sleeping bag was warm once I zipped it up tight. I listened for a while to the faint groans of the trees shifting in the wind. The woods were unusually silent that night. No distant calls, no rustling, nothing but the occasional creak and the sound of my own breathing. After a while, I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up once in the middle of the night. It was the kind of waking that comes without reason, your eyes opening to a darkness so thick it feels like you've been pulled out of sleep by something. I lay still, listening. For a long moment, I thought I heard movement, soft, deliberate, close to the tent. My heart rate rose instantly. I held my breath and strained to hear. The sound was faint, like something brushing across the ground, but then it faded into silence. I told myself it was a rabbit or a fox nosing around, maybe sniffing at my boots. I stayed awake longer than I meant to, waiting for the noise to return, but the silence swallowed everything again. Eventually, I forced myself back to sleep. When the first gray light of morning pushed through the nylon walls, I unzipped the tent, shivering in the damp air. My first thought was to pull on my boots, but when I looked down, I froze. They weren't there. Instead, sitting directly in front of the tent flap, placed neatly side by side as if someone had set them there with care, was a dead rabbit. Its body was limp, its fur matted, and its eyes clouded. There wasn't much blood, just enough to see that its throat had been cut or torn. The way it had been laid out, straight, deliberate, made my stomach turn. I stepped back inside the tent, unsteady, staring at the spot where my boots should have been. The first thing that went through my head was an animal had taken them during the night. That made sense at first, maybe a raccoon or a coyote dragged them off, maybe even a fox. But animals don't replace boots with a rabbit. Animals don't set things down neatly in front of a tent flap like that. That was the work of a person. I crouched low, scanning the ground. The soil around the tent was soft, a thin layer of damp leaves pressed into the dirt. I expected to see tracks, paw prints, claw marks, boot prints, but there was almost nothing clear. Just faint disturbances in the leaves, enough to suggest something had moved around, but not enough to tell what. The sight of that rabbit sat heavy in my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside the tent in the dark, holding my boots, setting the animal down carefully, and then walking away without a sound. It was the silence that struck me most. I had been right there on the other side of the nylon wall, awake at one point, listening. Whoever had been there had moved quiet enough that I hadn't heard them clearly. I backed up, sat in the tent, and stared at the flap for a long while. My boots were gone, and without them, the hike out would be miserable, maybe even dangerous with how rocky the trail was. But more than that, the thought of putting my feet on the ground where someone else had stood filled me with unease I couldn't shake. Eventually, I forced myself to pack. My hands trembled as I stuffed the sleeping bag away and collapsed the tent. Every snap of a branch in the distance made me whip my head around. The woods that had felt peaceful the night before now seemed watchful, like eyes were on me from behind the trees. I left the rabbit where it was. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The sight of it lying so carefully placed outside my tent burned into me as I tightened my pack and laced up the spare pair of light trail shoes I had shoved deep inside my bag. They weren't made for the rocky terrain, but they would have to do. The hike back felt endless. Every step I took, I imagined someone else had been walking in those same woods just hours before, close enough to steal from me, close enough to leave me a message. That's what it felt like, a message. Not random, not a prank. A deliberate sign left behind for me to find when I opened my tent. By the time I reached the trailhead and the safety of my car, the sun was high and the woods were alive with the ordinary sounds of birds and wind. But none of it eased the weight of what had happened. I kept replaying it in my head. The missing boots, the soft sound in the night, the dead rabbit arranged so neatly, like it was meant to mean something. To this day, I don't know what it meant. I don't know if someone was watching me, testing me, or simply trying to scare me off. All I know is that someone had been close to me while I slept, close enough to touch my things, close enough to decide what I would wake up to. That's what unsettles me most. It wasn't the missing boots, and it wasn't even the rabbit itself. It was the thought of a stranger moving silently in the dark, inches from where I lay, leaving behind a sign that they had been there and then disappearing without a sound. I've camped many times since, but I never again leave my boots outside the tent. I keep everything zipped in with me, every piece of gear, no matter how dirty, because that night taught me something I can't ignore. It's not the animals in the woods you have to watch for. It's the people you don't hear until the morning, when you step outside and realize someone was standing there, just on the other side of the thin wall, and chose to leave you something you'll never forget. I had set up camp in a small clearing about 2 miles off the main trail. It was the kind of spot I liked, quiet, hidden, with just enough open ground for a tent and a fire pit. The weather was cool, and the woods were silent except for the occasional groan of branches rubbing together in the wind. By the time I had finished my small meal and packed things away, the sky was pitch black, and the forest around me had gone still. I crawled into my tent around 10:30, zipped the flap tight, and slid into my sleeping bag. The night was so dark that I couldn't even make out the shapes of the trees beyond the nylon walls. For hours, nothing disturbed me. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking once to adjust my bag, then settling again. At some point, I woke up suddenly without knowing why. The air felt colder, heavier. I rolled onto my side and glanced at my watch. The glow told me it was just after 3 a.m. My eyes were still foggy with sleep when I noticed a pale light flicker across the fabric of my tent. At first I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds, but it wasn't steady. It moved, sweeping slowly across one side of the tent and then back again. A flashlight beam. The light was close, so close that the outline of the beam was sharp through the nylon. It slid from corner to corner, pausing at spots as though whoever held it was studying the tent carefully. My stomach tightened instantly. I froze in place, barely breathing, staring at the shifting glow. What unsettled me most was the silence. The forest was quiet, but so was the movement outside. No footsteps in the leaves, no twigs snapping, no sound of breathing, just the slow, deliberate sweep of that flashlight beam circling my tent. I stayed absolutely still, my heart hammering so hard I thought the noise might give me away. My first thought was that it had to be another camper, maybe someone who had gotten lost and stumbled into my clearing. But I knew that wasn't right. I hadn't seen or heard another person all day. There were no cars parked at the trailhead but mine, no signs of anyone else heading out this far. The beam moved around the tent again, this time lower, almost at the ground, then higher, scanning near where my head lay against the wall. It paused there, and I pressed myself down into the bag, hoping the nylon didn't show my outline. The seconds dragged on endlessly before the light shifted again. I debated grabbing my own flashlight or knife from my pack, but the thought of making noise stopped me. If I moved, they would know I was awake. If I stayed still, maybe they would think I was asleep and move on. My body was rigid with tension, every muscle aching as I waited. The light circled again. Then, after what felt like forever, it started to fade. I watched it retreat slowly across the walls of the tent until it was gone. Darkness swallowed the clearing again. I strained my ears, desperate for footsteps or any sound of movement, but there was nothing, only silence. I lay there for the rest of the night, eyes wide open, waiting for the beam to return. It never did. When the first gray light of morning crept in, I finally unzipped the tent, my throat dry and my hands shaking. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before. Trees standing still, ground littered with leaves, my fire pit cold and dead. Nothing looked out of place. I walked the perimeter slowly, scanning the ground for signs. In the damp soil and leaves, I expected to find boot prints or some trace of someone standing there. But there was nothing clear, just faint scuffs too messy to make sense of. It was like whoever had been there had moved with care, not leaving the kind of obvious prints you'd expect. The absence of sound still lingered in my head. If it had been an animal, I would have heard it rustling. If it had been another hiker, their steps would have broken twigs, shifted leaves. But there had been nothing, just that slow-moving flashlight beam sliding across the walls of my tent. I packed up quickly after that. My movements were stiff, mechanical, like I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Every gust of wind, every creak of the trees made me look over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it should have. My shoes scuffed loudly against the dirt, a sharp contrast to the memory of the silence that had surrounded my tent only hours before. When I reached my car, I sat inside for a long moment before starting it, staring back at the trailhead. I tried to convince myself it had been another hiker who had stumbled into my camp by accident, but the memory of that silence wouldn't let me believe it. A person moving through leaves and brush makes noise. There's no way around it. But this hadn't. Whoever it was had circled my tent in total silence, close enough to shine a beam directly at my head, and then disappeared without a sound. That thought has stuck with me more than anything else. The woods are full of animals, storms, accidents, things that scare you but that you can explain. But a flashlight beam moving around your tent at 3 in the morning, with no sound, no tracks, and no sign of another person for miles, that's different. It leaves you with questions you can't answer. Who was out there? Why didn't they say anything? Why didn't they leave a trace? The only thing I know for sure is that I was not alone in that clearing, and someone stood just outside my tent in the middle of the night, close enough to touch it, choosing to stay silent while I lay frozen inside. That's why now, whenever I camp, I find myself waking up at night, staring at the tent walls, waiting for the faint glow of a flashlight beam to return. It hasn't yet, but the memory of it is enough. The silence is worse than any sound. because sound tells you what's there. Silence means you don't know who's standing just beyond the fabric, watching. I had gone camping deep in the woods, far enough from the trail that I felt completely alone. The spot I picked was flat and tucked in between a few tall pines, not too close to water but far enough away from anyone else that I could hear nothing but wind and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I set up my small tent, built a small fire, and cooked something simple before the sun dropped behind the trees. By the time darkness settled, the fire was glowing low and the forest had gone still. It was the kind of silence that can feel heavy. I remember crawling into my tent, sliding into my sleeping bag, and lying there listening to the creaks of the woods around me. The fabric of the tent was thin, and every sound carried through it. Small rustles, faint pops from cooling wood, the wind pushing against the branches overhead. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep. The night wasn't restful. I woke up more than once, always with that uneasy feeling that something had stirred nearby. Once I thought I heard footsteps, faint and deliberate, but when I held my breath and listened harder, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, nerves making something out of the ordinary sounds of the forest. Eventually, I forced myself back to sleep, though I never fell fully into it. When the pale gray light of morning finally seeped through the tent walls, I opened my eyes and lay still for a moment, letting myself breathe. I was tired, but relieved it was morning. I reached to unzip the tent flap, but something caught my eye. Right next to where my head had been resting all night, smeared across the nylon wall of the tent, was a large, muddy handprint. I froze. My body went cold all over as I stared at it. The print was clear enough to make out the full palm and fingers, each one long and wide, spread slightly apart. The streaks of mud ran down from the edges, showing where it had been pressed hard into the fabric before sliding slightly. It wasn't small. Whoever had left it had a big hand, larger than mine by a good margin. I sat there staring, replaying the night in my head. At some point, while I had been sleeping with my head inches away, someone had leaned down and pressed their hand against the tent wall. They had been right there, close enough to touch me through the nylon, close enough to know exactly where I was lying. I crawled out of the tent slowly, my eyes scanning the clearing. Everything looked the same as it had when I set up camp. The fire pit was cold, my pack was untouched, but the ground told a different story. The soil was soft from the night's dew, and when I looked closely, I saw faint impressions around the tent. Not deep, not clear, but enough to suggest someone had walked there. A few partial boot prints, smudged into the dirt, leading in from the tree line and back out again. I crouched down to study them, my throat dry. The prints weren't animal. They were from boots heavier than my own. Whoever had been there had approached the tent during the night, close enough to leave that muddy handprint, and then walked away before the light came. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was another camper, someone lost or curious. But that didn't sit right. There had been no voices, no light, no sounds of someone moving around openly. Whoever it was hadn't announced themselves, hadn't asked for help, hadn't even made enough noise to wake me fully. They had moved silently, placed their hand on the tent, and then vanished back into the woods. The thought of it made my stomach twist. The print wasn't random. It was right where my head had been, like they had been testing how close they could get without me noticing. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. I stood there staring at the handprint for a long time, the silence of the woods pressing in around me. Every rustle of leaves suddenly felt threatening, every shadow between the trees like it might hide someone watching. I packed up quickly after that. My hands shook as I rolled my sleeping bag and collapsed the tent. The muddy smear stood out stark against the nylon as I folded it, and I had to force myself to keep moving, to shove it into my pack and not think about it. Every sound in the woods made me snap my head up, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. The hike back out felt twice as long as the way in. My trail shoes thudded against the dirt, loud and clumsy compared to the silence I remembered from the night before. I couldn't stop imagining someone else moving through those same woods, following me, staying just far enough back that I'd never hear them. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car sitting alone, the relief was sharp, but it didn't erase the weight of what had happened. I sat in the driver's seat for a long while before starting the engine, staring back at the line of trees, thinking about that handprint. That image has stuck with me more than anything else I've ever experienced outdoors. Not an animal encounter, not a storm, not the usual dangers you prepare for. Just a single muddy handprint left inches from where I had been sleeping, left by someone who had stood right outside my tent in the middle of the night, close enough to touch, and then slipped away without a word. That's what unsettles me most. The handprint was proof. Proof that I wasn't alone. Proof that someone was watching, close enough to reach me if they wanted. They hadn't taken anything, hadn't spoken, hadn't hurt me. They had just wanted me to know they had been there. And now, every time I set up a tent, I find myself running my hand across the walls in the morning, half dreading the feel of mud under my fingers, because I know what it means when you find it. It means someone stood silently beside you in the night, their hand pressing against the only thin barrier between you and them, and you never even woke up. I had hiked deep into the backcountry that day, far enough that I knew there wasn't another person within miles of me. The trailhead was 10 miles back, and the last time I had seen another hiker was hours earlier in the morning. By the time I picked a clearing to set up camp, I felt fully isolated. That was the whole point of the trip. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I pitched my tent in a flat spot surrounded by trees that were tall and thick, their branches weaving together overhead. There was no sound of traffic, no voices, not even a distant plane in the sky. Just the breeze, the occasional bird call, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I cooked a small dinner over the stove, stowed my food carefully, and sat for a while as the light faded. When the sun finally dipped and the shadows closed in, the forest went still in that way that can make you hyper-aware of every sound. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay in my sleeping bag. The ground was firm but manageable, the air cool enough that the bag felt comforting. For a while, I listened to the woods settle. Twigs snapped far off, maybe from a deer. The wind moved softly through the branches. It wasn't peaceful sleep I was heading into. It never really is when I camp alone, but it was quiet enough to let my body relax. At some point deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. It was that sudden shift from sleep to alertness, like something had tugged me awake. My eyes opened, and I just lay there in the darkness, listening. The forest was completely silent, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no insects, no distant movement. Just nothing. And then I heard it. It was faint, so faint that at first I thought I had imagined it. A whisper, my name, drawn out slowly, almost like a breath leaking through the fabric of the tent. Every muscle in my body went rigid. My heart thudded hard against my ribs as I stared into the blackness, trying to process what I had heard. I wasn't near anyone. There was no one within miles. I had hiked all day to make sure of that. But the sound had been clear. Someone outside my tent had whispered my name. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. My ears strained against the silence, waiting for another sound. The nylon walls felt paper thin. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close enough that I could have reached my hand out and touched them if the tent wasn't there. The seconds dragged by. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just my imagination, some trick of my brain as it shifted between sleep and wakefulness. But the sound had been too sharp, too real. I knew what I had heard. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. My body wanted to freeze, but my brain kept running through options. Should I unzip the tent and look? Should I grab my knife? Should I yell? Every possibility felt wrong. If someone really was out there, I didn't want to give them the advantage of knowing I was awake. Finally, after what might have been minutes or maybe an hour, I heard something else. A soft crunch of leaves, slow and careful, just outside the tent. Whoever it was hadn't left. They were still there, moving around in the dark. My throat went dry, and I could feel sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the chill in the air. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay perfectly still, every nerve on fire, listening to the occasional shift of movement outside. Sometimes it seemed closer, sometimes farther, but never gone. The silence in between those sounds was almost worse, because I never knew if they were crouched just outside, waiting. When the first gray light of dawn started to seep through the fabric, I finally let myself breathe a little easier. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from lying tense for so long, and unzipped the tent flap just a crack. The clearing looked empty. The trees stood silent, nothing moving among them. I waited, scanning every line of shadow, every branch before finally stepping out. The ground told the truth. Around the tent, in the soft earth and leaf litter, were prints. Boot prints, not mine. They circled the tent, some close enough that the toes pointed directly at where I had been lying. The sight of them made my stomach turn. I followed them a little way into the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tracks led in from deeper in the woods, not from the trail. Whoever it had been hadn't followed me in from the start. They had come in from somewhere else, maybe living out there, maybe hiding. The thought of it was worse than anything I had imagined in the night. I didn't waste time packing neatly. I shoved everything into my pack, broke camp in record time, and hit the trail. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. The hike out felt endless. My legs were heavy, my mouth dry, but I pushed faster than I normally would. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to drink until I was well back toward the trailhead. The thought of pausing, of giving whoever it was time to close the distance, kept me moving. When I finally saw my car parked alone at the empty trailhead, the relief hit me hard. I climbed in, locked the doors immediately, and just sat there gripping the steering wheel. My pack lay in the seat beside me, half open from how quickly I had stuffed it. I didn't even care. I just wanted to get as far from those woods as possible. The whisper is what stays with me, the sound of my own name, carried through the stillness of the night, from someone who should not have been there. Whoever it was knew I was camping alone, knew exactly where I was lying, and wanted me to hear them. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And that's the part that keeps me from camping alone the way I used to. Because I know now that the forest can be silent, the trails can be empty, and you can still not be alone. Someone out there knew my name and whispered it in the dark, 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, just to let me know they were there. I've spent a lot of nights camping in the wilderness, from dense forests in the Pacific Northwest to open deserts in Arizona, and I've faced my fair share of wildlife encounters. Bears, mountain lions, coyotes, you name it. Most of the time, the animals kept their distance, and the worst fear was the natural kind, the kind you could anticipate with careful preparation. But there's one lesson I've learned that sticks with me. A random person in the woods is far scarier than almost any animal, and nothing reinforces that lesson like a particular trip I took with some friends a few years ago. We had planned a group camping trip in a remote area, far from any roads or cell service. The location was deep in the forest, a few hours outside the nearest town. We wanted isolation, peace, and a bit of adventure. None of us were hardcore survivalists, but we were competent enough to pack tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and enough firewood for a couple of nights. The drive out was long, dusty, and filled with excitement. By the time we arrived, the sun was dropping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing where we planned to set up camp. We picked a flat area with a few tall pines around the perimeter, enough shade for tents and a good view of the forest opening. After setting up tents and organizing gear, we built a fire and relaxed, joking and laughing as the sky darkened. The smell of burning pine, combined with the crisp forest air, made the place feel like paradise. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly safe. That night, after dinner and a few beers, we turned in early. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every small sound startling. I was just drifting off when I heard it, a faint scraping, a soft shuffle near the edge of our campsite. I froze, straining to hear. The sound repeated, coming closer. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe a coyote or a raccoon rummaging near the trash. Then it got worse. The sound moved along the perimeter of our tents, deliberate and slow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my friends in their tents. Without a word, we all understood. Someone was out there, moving among our tents. The realization hit me harder than any animal ever could. A bear or a mountain lion is predictable. You know how it moves, you know how it hunts. A person, though, can make choices, can hide, can sneak up on you. That uncertainty, that intent is terrifying. I gripped the flashlight I always kept handy and quietly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Shadows shifted between the trees, and for a moment I couldn't tell what I was looking at. Then I saw the silhouette. A man, tall and lanky, moving slowly toward one of the other tents. My stomach dropped. I motioned to my friends inside, and we all froze, pretending to sleep, holding our breath. The man stopped, crouched, and then moved to the next tent. He sniffed near the entrance, rifled briefly through gear left outside, and then moved on again. We were all paralyzed. This was nothing like a wildlife encounter. There was no instinctive logic, no predictable behavior. Every shadow, every movement was a decision made with intent. I remember thinking how surreal it was that I was in the middle of a forest, completely exposed, and the danger wasn't a wild animal, it was a human who could choose to hurt us, who could be anywhere around us, and whose intentions were completely unknown. That uncertainty made my fear spiral. Finally, one of our friends, braver, or perhaps just more reckless, popped out of his tent with a gun, shouting and waving his arms. He hoped the noise would scare the man off. The figure froze for a moment, then bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps fading was like a wave of tension leaving our bodies, but it didn't dissipate entirely. We all scrambled, quietly gathering gear, packing tents, and loading the trucks as quickly as possible. Every creak of the forest under our feet, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. By the time we were driving away, our hearts were still racing. We didn't stop to look back, even as the lights of our trucks bounced off the forest floor. The experience left me with a vivid understanding. Animals are frightening, yes, but predictable. A random human with the ability to make choices with no rules except their own is a far more dangerous unknown. The fear comes from uncertainty, from intent, and from the awareness that the situation could escalate in ways you cannot predict. A year later, we went back, thinking the first incident had been a fluke. This time, we planned to be safer. No tents, sleeping in the beds of our trucks and SUVs, thinking a vehicle would make us untouchable. The first night was calm, almost too calm. I was in the back of my SUV, my girlfriend next to me, when I felt a sudden bright light on my face. My immediate reaction was to wake up, shout, maybe confront whoever it was. But instinctively, I stayed still, pretending to sleep, hoping the intruder didn't know we were awake. The person moved to the next truck, shining the light on everyone inside. The fear was instant and overwhelming. I could hear the faint shuffle of my friends pretending to sleep, hearts racing as ours were. The unknown was terrifying. Unlike an animal, this person could think, plan, and choose what to do. He could be anywhere around us, making decisions at will. I waited until the light moved away, then bolted from the vehicle, waking my friends. Everyone was shaken, panic and adrenaline making our movements frantic. We packed up quickly and left without hesitation, driving toward the nearest town as fast as we dared. Those nights taught me something important about fear. Animals, even predators like mountain lions or bears, have predictable behavior. You can anticipate their reactions, and you have a chance to act accordingly. Humans, though, are different. They can make choices, plan, and change their actions in ways you cannot foresee. The uncertainty and intent make the fear sharper, more consuming, and far more personal. From that point on, I approached camping differently. I became hyper-aware of surroundings, cautious about where I slept, careful with how I stored gear, and always aware that the real danger might not be the wildlife at all. The lessons were harsh, but they were clear. The wilderness is unpredictable enough without adding human danger into the mix, and nothing, no animal, no storm, no bear, compares to the dread of knowing that a person, completely capable of harm, is out there, making choices that could affect your life. Even now, whenever I'm setting up a campsite, I think back to those nights. I check the perimeter, lock vehicles, keep flashlights and weapons handy, and never underestimate the potential of someone to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That understanding of real, unpredictable human danger is something that will stay with me forever, and it's made me far more cautious and far less trusting when I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I had camped plenty of times before, and I thought I had seen and heard just about everything the woods could throw at me. I had dealt with raccoons trying to get into my food bag, deer stomping around the tent at night, even coyotes howling close enough to raise the hair on my arms. But nothing had prepared me for that night. It was a late fall trip, one of those where the air turns sharp after sunset and the forest feels emptier than it does in summer. I had hiked most of the day and found a clearing a little ways off the trail, flat enough to pitch the tent. The leaves on the ground were dry, the trees tall and bare, their branches black against the fading light. I cooked a simple meal, sat quietly for a while as the forest grew darker, then tucked into my sleeping bag to escape the cold. Inside the tent, the night was quiet. The usual nighttime noises were there. An occasional snap of a branch, the distant rustle of leaves, but nothing alarming. The temperature dropped more as the hours went on, and I pulled the bag tighter around me, shifting onto my side to find some comfort. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was awake in total darkness. At first, I didn't know why. My body was stiff, my ears ringing with silence. Then it happened. The whole tent came down on top of me. 1 second, I was lying there staring into the black, and the next the nylon fabric collapsed over my face and shoulders with a heavy, sudden weight. It wasn't the slow sag of a pole slipping out of place. It was violent, like something had thrown itself against the tent and crushed it flat in an instant. I panicked, thrashing against the fabric, my arms and legs tangling with the sleeping bag. My first thought was that a bear had landed on top of me. I clawed at the zipper, shoving with all the strength I had until I got free. When I burst out into the cold air, my chest heaving, I spun in every direction. My flashlight was still inside, so I was blind except for the pale glow of the moon. The trees stood silent and black, the clearing open and still. Nothing moved, no sound, just me, barefoot on the frozen leaves, staring into emptiness. The tent lay half collapsed, the poles bent inward as if something heavy had slammed into it and then vanished. I circled it slowly, every nerve on edge, scanning the tree line for any sign of life. If it had been an animal, I should have heard it crashing away into the woods. If it had been the wind, I would have felt it, but the night air was still. I grabbed the flashlight from the tangled mess of the tent and shined it around the clearing. The beam cut across the ground, the trunks of trees, the broken outline of branches overhead. Nothing. I held the light low and looked for tracks in the leaves, but all I saw were the marks from my own boots earlier. No paw prints, no drag marks, no sign of weight moving across the earth. The silence pressed in around me. I stood there for what felt like forever, the light trembling slightly in my hand, waiting for something to show itself. Nothing did. Finally, I forced myself back toward the tent. The poles were bent, but not broken, and I managed to wedge them back into place enough to give the structure shape again. My hands shook as I worked, my breath clouding in the beam of the light. Every sound I made seemed too loud. I sat there inside the half-fixed shelter, wide awake, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the knife I kept near my bag in the other. My eyes stayed on the thin nylon walls, half expecting to see them cave in again. Every rustle outside made my heart lurch. Sleep never came back to me that night. I just sat, staring, waiting for morning. When daylight finally seeped through the fabric, I scrambled out and inspected the ground again. The clearing looked normal in the gray light, the leaves untouched except for the area around the tent. No signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away, just nothing. The tent still bore the evidence, though. One side was bowed in, the pole warped from the force of whatever had hit it. I ran my hand across the nylon, imagining the weight that had crushed it down. Too heavy to be a raccoon, too deliberate to be the wind. But nothing had left a trace behind. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag without much care for order. The longer I stayed there, the more exposed I felt. The tree line seemed to watch me, every shadow a pair of eyes. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop for water. I just shouldered the weight and started walking, fast, back toward the trailhead. The hike out felt endless. I kept glancing behind me, half convinced I'd see someone, or something, walking the same path at a distance. Every time I stopped, even for a second, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down. It was the same sensation I'd had when the tent fell in. Something unseen, close enough to touch, but leaving nothing behind. By the time I reached my car, my legs were sore and my throat dry, but I didn't care. I threw the pack into the back seat and drove off, not looking in the mirror until the road had carried me miles away from the woods. I've thought about that night countless times since. I've replayed the sound of the poles snapping inward, the sudden suffocating crush of the tent around me, and the empty clearing that met me when I got out. I still don't have an answer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal I could explain. And it wasn't nothing, because I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. Whatever it was, it came down on me hard in the middle of the night, then disappeared without leaving a single trace. That knowledge stays with me more than anything. The idea that someone or something can step into your life out there in the woods, crush your shelter flat in the dark, and then vanish as if they were never there at all. That was the last time I camped alone in a tent. I can still feel that nylon pressing against my face, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I had been camping alone that weekend, miles off the main trail where I knew no one else would likely pass. The sun had gone down hours earlier, and I had built a small fire that burned low in the ring of stones I had stacked together. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire was nothing but embers and a few faint flames licking at the charred wood. It gave off a dim, flickering light that cast strange shapes on the trees around me. I remember feeling comfort in that small glow before zipping myself in for the night. Inside the tent, I stretched out in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of the fire as it died down outside. The fabric walls glowed faintly orange, the last traces of firelight pushing through them. I stared at that glow for a long time, tired from the day's hike, but not quite ready to drift into sleep. The night was calm. No strong wind, no heavy noises from the forest, just the faint background hum of nature at rest. I must have dozed lightly, because the next thing I remember was my eyes snapping open. I didn't know what pulled me out of that half-sleep, but I lay still, staring at the fabric of the tent. The firelight still flickered faintly outside, casting shadows across the thin nylon. And that's when I saw it. A human shape moved across the wall of my tent. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fire had burned so low that the light was weak and uneven, but there it was, clear as anything. Shoulders, head, the outline of arms and legs. Someone was walking past my tent, close enough that their shape stretched across the thin wall like ink spilled over paper. My chest tightened instantly. I had hiked miles into the woods. I hadn't seen another person all day. No voices, no footprints, no sign that anyone was out there but me. And yet, there was the unmistakable shadow of a person, just a thin layer of nylon separating us. I froze, my breath shallow, every muscle tensed. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the fire, maybe a branch swaying, but the shape was too precise. The head, the way it moved at the right height, the rhythm of steps, it wasn't random. It was someone. The shadow lingered near the tent for what felt like forever. It shifted slightly, like whoever it was had stopped to look at the tent. The thought of someone standing silently outside, watching me while I lay inside with no barrier but fabric, sent a wave of panic through me. I didn't move a muscle, afraid that even the sound of my sleeping bag rustling would give me away. Finally, the shadow stretched and shifted again, drifting slowly away from the tent wall. I watched it pull across the fabric, elongating, until it slipped out of view. I strained my ears for sound, footsteps on leaves, branches snapping, but there was nothing, only silence. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, staring at the faint orange glow of the fire through the tent. My flashlight was by my side, and my knife lay near my bag, but I couldn't bring myself to move. If someone really was out there, fumbling around with gear would only alert them. So I waited. Minutes passed. The glow of the fire dimmed further, shadows fading into black. I told myself it could have been an illusion. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe the firelight made the branches outside look human-shaped. I repeated that thought in my head, over and over, trying to keep my breathing calm. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The hours dragged on. Every little sound outside made me jump. The crunch of settling leaves, the pop of the dying fire, the faint creak of branches shifting overhead. They all felt sharper, heavier, like they carried intention. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if someone was still moving around just beyond my sight. When the first hint of daylight came through, I finally felt like I could move again. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. The fire had burned itself to cold ash and blackened wood. The clearing was still, nothing moving in the pale gray light. But when I stepped out and looked closer, my stomach dropped. The dirt and leaves around the fire pit showed marks. Not paw prints, not random disturbances from animals. They were boots, fresh tracks pressed into the ground, circling the fire, circling the tent. They weren't mine. I could see the difference immediately. My boots had a different tread pattern, and I knew where I had walked the night before. These were new, crisp, and deliberate. I followed them a few steps toward the trees. They came in from the forest, stopped near the fire pit, moved around the tent, then vanished back into the woods in a different direction. Whoever it was hadn't stumbled upon my camp by accident. They had come close, lingered, and then left without a word. The worst part was that I never heard them. Not once. They had moved silently enough to circle my camp, stand outside my tent, and leave behind nothing but prints. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I shoved gear into my pack. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't take time to sit and drink water. I just wanted to be gone. The thought of whoever it was still being out there, maybe watching from the trees as I scrambled to leave, kept me moving fast. The hike back felt like a blur, every sound behind me making me whip my head around. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, and even then, I felt eyes on me as I loaded my pack into the car and drove away. That image never left me. The shadow of a person, clear and deliberate, stretched across the thin wall of my tent while I lay frozen inside. There's no mistaking what I saw, and the boot prints in the morning only confirmed it. Someone had come into my camp in the middle of the night, close enough to touch the fabric if they had wanted to. They stood there long enough for me to see their shape in the flickering firelight, and then they slipped back into the dark without a sound. That was the last time I camped alone without double-checking where I was. Because it's one thing to hear noises in the woods at night. It's another to know for certain that someone was there, silently watching from the other side of the fabric wall.